Hello, welcome back to Rachel's studio. Today we're going to talk about how to paint Christmas lights and all the different ways you can paint Christmas lights with my very favorite medium, watercolor. And this is yet one more reason to love watercolor. It's because you can do so many different things with it. And so I'm going to show you several different ways of how to paint Christmas tree lights. So let's go ahead and get started. And by the way, please be sure to leave me a comment. And the way you can help my channel grow is to watch this video to the end. And another way that you can support me in my art so that I can continue to bring you better and better content is to support me on Patreon. And there will be more detailed real-time videos about especially the moose painting, on how to paint the moose Christmas painting that will be featured in this video. So, okay, I have 8 different ways to paint a Christmas tree or Christmas tree lights. This is more about the Christmas tree lights. So the first way to paint lights is to use masking, and you can either dot it on manually or you can kind of tap it on and splash it on like I did there with my little paintbrush. And the whole idea is you want your little splatters to be a little uneven, and some of them are going to go out way beyond the tree. That's okay. Once they dry, you can just rub them up after they dry and just have the splatters where you want them. So I'm going to go ahead and let that dry and start my tree number 2. And in tree number 2, I'm going to first put clear water, which is my favorite way to work. And by the way, this is the tree that came out as my favorite and also my 4-year-old's favorite. It kind of uses my push technique. So if you have not seen my push technique video yet, definitely check out my push technique video, because this approach uses that technique. And what I'm going to do here is I'm painting wet and wet, which means my paper is wet and my brush has pretty wet paint in it. And I'm getting a little bit of Naphthol red and Holbein Aureolin. The Naphthol red is by M. Graham. My all-time favorite red is this. And then Winsor Violet. And I'm putting soft little wet and wet dots here and there. I'm trying to keep the pattern random again. That really helps your tree look more natural. There's some permanent green light. That's a Daniel Smith color that I use a lot. It has a permanent home on my palette. All these colors are colors that I use pretty regularly. And so I'm painting wet and wet. And then next I'm going to go in with some pretty dark paint and paint with dark kind of cream consistency paint in between those lights. And by the way, if you haven't checked out my watercolor basics playlist, be sure to check that out. And in that playlist, there's a video about the difference between tea, milk, and cream consistency paint. And that's all explained there. So I have quite a few beginners videos in that watercolor basics playlist. So be sure to check that out if you have no idea what I'm talking about. But this is pretty much cream consistency paint that I'm putting in here, and I'm painting around those lights. Do you see how I did that? I painted around them. I never painted over them. Then I'm going to put a few dark spots here and there to just make it look even more natural and more aesthetically pleasing. Variety is the name of the game when it comes to aesthetics. So you don't want an all flat green tree. You don't want an all flat blue-green tree. You want to use different colors in different areas of the tree to make it look more real, more natural, more interesting. And now I'm going to get clear water on my brush, just little half drops of water, not a lot, and I'm going to drip them in to the middle of those Christmas tree light spots, right in the middle. And what that does is it kind of cauliflowers out. If you don't know what cauliflowering in watercolor is, look it up. It's actually something you can use in your favor when it comes to painting lights, because the more wet areas that you drop in with that little drop of water will cauliflower out into the Christmas tree and kind of create glowing light effects. The way that I do this technique, the best way to do it is to kind of babysit it, and you'll see me go back to this tree to re-drop in clear water now and again until it's completely dry. So I just keep dropping in clear water over those Christmas tree light spots, as it dries and as that painting progresses in its drying state, so that I really play up those cauliflower effects. Because when the paper is half dry, that's when you get the most beautiful cauliflower effects. All right, now I'm going back to that tree where I put down the masking, and I'm taking up some of the masking in the areas where I didn't want it, like far away from the tree, and in other trees and squares next to the square of the tree. And then I'm gonna go in and just paint with milk consistency paint, and I mix my greens. And to get a more natural green, by the way, add a tiny little bit of red to your green mix, especially if you're using green from a tube. To get a more natural green, just add a little bit of red to it. It'll gray it down just a little skosh so it doesn't look so garish and unnatural. And do you notice how in the top of the tree is green, then in the middle it's bluer or cooler. Blue is cool, like ice. And then towards the bottom, I use a more yellow or more warm green. And then at the very, very bottom, that's even more blue, cooler. So that's another example of me using different colors to keep my tree interesting. And you see where the masking is. You can see where the masking is. I haven't taken my masking up. Don't take your masking up until you're totally done with your tree. And see there, I'm babysitting that tree again over there on the right, putting in more tiny little half dots of clear water to continue to encourage those lights to push out into that dark pigment around the Christmas light dots. And then as it was drying, I saw that some of the lights were kind of getting too light. They looked too pastel, and I wanted them to be really red or really green or really yellow. So I went in with tea consistency, between tea and milk consistency, quite watery paint, and I dropped in some more green or some more red or whatever color to really pop out those light Christmas light spot colors. All right. Now, this is a tree that I'm going to paint just regular. I'm going to paint several different colors to make it more interesting, as usual, using the side of my brush. That's a wet on dry technique. When you paint with wet paint onto dry paper, that's what we watercolors call wet on dry. And it makes a nice little rough edge, and that works really well for a tree. So by the way, that's what I was doing, using different colors, and then I'm going to let that dry, and then I'll go back over that tree with a white gel pen. All right, now I'm starting this next tree. Now I do have some pigment in my brush, so that's nice because you guys can see what I'm doing, but what I was trying to do was to put down just clear water. So but as dark as I'm going to get this tree, it doesn't matter that there's a little pigment. But I'm going to use salt on this one, and I was just showing you there how different paints react differently to salt. Like ultramarine blue doesn't have as soft of salt effects as phthalo blue, which I hardly ever paint with phthalo blue. But in this case, I would paint my tree with some phthalo blue or some other fine grained paint color. Phthalo blue is good. Again, see how many different colors I used in that tree, so it's not all flat green. And then while it's still wet, I'm going to use two different kinds of salt. Kosher salt, which is big flecks, and table salt, which is little tiny flecks. And you don't want to put a lot. If you put too many, then the salt interacts too much and it doesn't make that salt texture. So I'm going to let that dry. You just leave the salt on there, let it dry and do its thing. And in the meantime, let's move on to tree number 5. And this one I'm going to do kind of like a pen and ink or line wash technique. And this, I'm totally winging this, you guys. I didn't know if it would work or not, but I thought I would draw my tree with some Christmas stars on it and see what would happen if I kind of did the same kind of push technique approach to it, but instead use stars and just yellow colors and not had any have any colorful lights on this tree. So I'm just putting some yellow onto dry paper. So that's wet on dry technique. And by the way, the pen that I used was a Tombow calligraphy pen. Love that thing. Just got it in the mail last week. I did a whole tutorial on how I used it to make a Christmas mousse for my Patreon students. So be sure to join my Patreon to check out some of those fun lessons. That lesson is in my $5 tier, so you can get for $5 you can access my whole library of over 20 tutorials. It's a really good deal. And then if you decide you like my Patreon, then you can move up to the $8 tier where you will have access to all my tutorials. All right, and then I'm painting green around those yellow dots that I just put in and letting the green kind of touch that yellow, and then going back into the yellow and putting more yellow, watery yellow, so it kind of bleeds out into the green. And then later I'll go in and say, oh, it's mixing together too much. So then I wring out my brush, get a clean brush, clear water, wring that out so it's kind of like a mop, and then kind of daub up some of the color that came into the stars, and then go back into those dried, dabbed off stars and put more yellow and more water. All right, now I'm babysitting the salt. See how the salt is starting to make those textures over there on the salt tree? I dropped more water onto the salt crystals to help that cauliflower out even more, just to make that an even more noticeable effect. Okay, here's my approach number 6, using a Crayola white wax crayon, just a regular old child's white crayon. I made wax stars so it acts like a resist, so when you paint over it, the stars will show through. So I put clear water, and I'm just going to use my charge technique that I use so often and just go in with every brush full, a little bit different color, painting a lot with the edge of my brush to create interesting textures on the sides of the trees. There I'm using Winsor green gold. That is such a pretty color, you guys. I love that. And you can see the stars starting to kind of, they're more subtle. This is more subtle than using masking, but you can see the stars kind of appear as I add paint over them, and I'm painting right over them. And later I'll go in with a brush that's wrung out with clear water and just kind of dab off the paint that is over the wax to kind of make them stand out even more. But then I go in with some ultramarine blue. Oops, I made a mistake there. And I go in with some cream consistency ultramarine blue to here and there put darker spots in that tree. So there's 6 trees that, and I feel like I really liked all of them. But okay, wait, we have to do the gel pen part. Don't forget the gel pen part. This is a gel pen by Uniball, Signo Uniball. I like their wide one. They do have a wide white gel pen. And I'm just going in and just doing my stars and doing something simple. You could do anything. You could draw in some ornaments or stars or lights or whatever. So there's a lot of different things that you could draw. I chose stars. I'm a big fan of stars. All right, now I'm wiping off my masking over there on that tree, and you can see how it left splotches behind. Now you could leave it just like that, or just for the sake of this demonstration for you guys, I went in and put some paint. I used some yellow on some of them and some naphthol red on some of them. And here I'm putting a little bit of water. Oh no, that was yellow. I put some yellow on, and now I'm going to put some red in a few of the other ones just to show you guys this is a way to get like really brightly colored ornaments that don't have any green underneath them, so they really shine. So you can do it that way, or you can just leave them white. There's so many different ways to do this. Look how that salt, by the way, is creating those textures as it dries. It gets more and more noticeable over there. All right, see here I'm cleaning up my little stars, going in with a brush that's just damp with clean water and just kind of dotting up so you can see the stars a little better. That worked pretty well, but there might be more artist grade wax products out there that I never use this technique, but I wanted to try it for you guys because it is one more way to get some interesting Christmas light and ornament effects. And here I'm going in on the salt tree. Those little dabs aren't quite dry yet, so you can still cauliflower them out a little bit by dripping a tiny little bit of water into the whitest areas, the little white dots. And I love that. That tree looks really good. I decided to add some little tree trunks, and then I'll go in over what I just put in with some burnt sienna at the very bottom of each of them just to give them a little bit more dimension. so it's not a flat burnt sienna tree trunk, just to add a nice little detail. Now I'm going to cut these up and I'm going to use them as cards and send them out to some of my longest running Patreon students. I think that's what I'll do with them. I'll use them as gifts for my students. All right, so here's the moose, you guys. This one was so fun. I was so excited how this turned out, but here's me painting in those antlers and doing it on wet paper, just like I did one of the Christmas trees, where I just painted the Christmas tree lights onto wet paper, so it's wet and wet, so they blossom out, and then paint the dark antlers around them, and then as it all dries, babysit it and drop little bits of clear water in over the Christmas tree lights. As it dries, I just kept going back over all of it and dropping in tiny little dots, just tiny little dots of water and or pigment to really play up the lights against those dark antlers. And I thought it was a really nice effect. Okay, here's my last example, example number 8. This is a moose, and I'm painting on completely wet paper there, and I just dropped in colors. This is the easiest way to do it, I think. I just dropped in pure color onto white paper and then used a pen and ink technique with my calligraphy pen to connect it all. And then I painted in a little bit of light antler color around the lights. All right, so there you have it. 6 different Christmas trees plus a couple Christmas moose, and you guys now should be armed with all the information that you need to paint the kind of Christmas tree lights you like. I'd love to hear in the comments from you guys which Christmas tree is your favorite, and do you have yet another way to paint Christmas tree lights? Also, remember, if you want to watch this in real time, I will make that available on my Patreon so you can paint it along with me, and that will probably be more like a half-hour long tutorial where you can paint along with me as I explain what I'm doing. So I'd love to see you there, and I hope you guys are going into a wonderful holiday season, and please stay safe and take care, and I will see you next week when I have a new video, so I hope you'll subscribe. Bye, you guys.